I appreciate we're now recording. So appreciate everyone on the last minute switch here. I decided that it's really important that you know everything about going into your project before we start project week. So we're pushing back ES6 and prototypical inheritance to next week. That doesn't mean skip that. But I want to like spend some time building a project. And there's a couple of things I want to get to, maybe not today, but definitely by Tuesday. I'm going to cover off on a couple of things regards to has many belongs to relationships that we haven't really built out yet. But what I'm going to do today is I'm going to quickly go over the requirements for the project. And then after that, I'm going to start building out an app. And hopefully by the end of today, you'll at least get a sense of how we can create multiple pages in a single page application, how we can create our file structure, and we can begin to talk about has many and belongs to. That might fall to next Tuesday though. In which case, if we do fall to next Tuesday, then ES6 will be on Thursday. YOLO. But for now, let's dive into the requirements, just to make sure everyone kind of gets a sense. I'm going to think about what to do tomorrow, because what I found is that if we when I book things for like midday on Friday, half of you can't make it because you have jobs or other obligations or kids to wrangle or something like that. So I'm trying to avoid doing any necessary knowledge dumps. It might become I'm probably going to, depending on how we do things today, make it an optional place where I do some refactors and add a couple of interesting features to our little project build. Maybe like add a modal or something like that. And we'll figure it out there. But I am also still taking recommendations for what you would like me to talk about tomorrow during office hours. Cool. So I'm going to share my screen. We're going to start going through the requirements. The big one that I need to emphasize now, because it seems to still surprise people. And I think part of it is I was just skimming through this requirement again. It's not very explicit. When we say single page application, right? What this means is you are working on one HTML document that does not refresh or reload the page or click to another HTML document. So I want to talk a little bit about what that means. I'm going to show you a lot of what that means today. But the way we built out the Cats app at the beginning, where we had a bunch of different HTML pages that we would go to, is not how we're going to do this for the requirement. So when you click on a link, like it might seem like you're going to a new page, and I'll show you how that looks today. But what we're really doing is just re-rendering new HTML with JavaScript. If at a certain point you are making a fetch, and then as soon as you fetch, you're like calling window.location.reload, or otherwise trying to refresh your page, or not preventing default on a form, you'll be sent back and you'll be like, hey, you're not currently passing the requirements. Our goal here is to make a completely refreshless page, where once the HTML is loaded, everything is changed with JavaScript. Do people get kind of a sense of what I mean by that? I'll show you today how you can make it feel like we're looking at multiple pages. And when we get to React, you'll really be able to make that work. But the important thing, if it looks like your page is refreshing at any point, if you're reloading the entire page, it's bad. If you really want to verify, like, double check, like try to add, like just, there's a bunch of different ways to check that you're not reloading anything, but just don't reload anything. Cool. So our goal here is we're going to be using HTML, CSS, and JavaScript for our front end and a Rails backend. Our Rails backend will have two models, at least. A has many and a belongs to. When I say a has many and belongs to, one caution that I bring up, I expect these both to be classes that have multiple instances, and that aren't like hard coded on your front end. So what I mean by that is I've seen two different really common patterns, right? Where a student like will be like, hey, I'm going to have a game that I'm rendering on my front end, and a game has many scores, and then they're just rendering one game. And so they're like hard coding in the ID of the game to create their scores, right? And I want to see multiple different things that something can belong to. So if you have a class has many of something else, I don't want to see just a singleton class in the first one. Does that make sense? And then I also probably, if you're rendering them, a set of them out to the page, I want you to be iterating through them. I don't want them to be hard coded in for both models. So both models, you don't necessarily need to be able to create items on both models, but if you added an instance, or like if you added a row to your like database on your has many association, your app shouldn't break. If you were like in your Rails console adding like, hey, I'm going to add a new house. No, it should exist on the front. It should be obvious on the front end. So right now, just to spoil what we're going to be building today. It is currently September, which means it is, in my mind, Halloween. So we're going to be building an app called ScareBnB, where we will be able to subdivide apartments and haunted houses. So we will be able to list many apartments. We'll have a list of apartments, or sorry, a list of houses, and then you can select a house and then list an apartment within that house. So initially, right, I'll just seed a few houses on the back end, right? And if I wanted to, right, the rest of, like, I could pass the requirements by having it so that you can click on one of those houses and then list apartments for that house, and then delete apartments or rent apartments. Either one will work. Just to be clear on why I should actually like write this down with a whiteboard of something that would work. Can we do this? There we go. So here we have boo. A house has many apartments, right? And if we were looking for the minimum requirements, can everyone see this whiteboard? No, right here. Okay. Resume share. How about now? Can we all see it? Cool. So really we need 3 fetches, right, to our app. So we can have an initial show all houses, right? And that's a fetch to the house index route. And then we can click in on that, right? And for those houses, right? Come on, buddy. So in this case, right, this is a create in the associated model. This is a read in this model. And this is an update, right? This would hit all the requirements. The one note, right? What I don't want to see is 3 houses hard coded in as this first one. I want it to be that if I added a 4th house, even on just the back end, it would be able to show up on the front end. So that means iterating through the houses that you get. Don't hard code anything in from your database. Does that make sense?
So are you saying then that your 3 fetch requests are those read, create, and update?
Yeah. In this case, in order for this to work, right? Seeing all the apartments on the houses, I can probably, when I fetch these houses, I can probably fetch them and their associated apartments. There might be a situation where you'd want to do 4 like fetches here, where you go ahead and say like, when you click on a house, do a fetch to that show page. But yeah. But the important thing here is that none of this is hard coded, right? We are fetching these houses from the back end, right? And all of this is going to be without changing the page. You'll believe me after this lecture that this is possible. Cool. So are we a little clear on what the requirements are right here? HTML, CSS, JavaScript. This makes fun. This makes sense. Rails API as the backend. Don't refresh the page. And then I'm expecting some object orientation. And one thing that I'm going to caution people, right? Oh wait, whoops! I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to start sharing my screen again. Object-oriented JavaScript. What I'm expecting there is not only are you initializing a class, an instance of a class, you are going to be calling methods on those classes. So one thing that I see from students who aren't comfortable with object-oriented JavaScript is they'll fetch a bunch of houses from the backend, initialize a bunch of house instances, but then go back to just using functional programming. So they don't actually use the houses that they initialize. Try to make sure you're calling methods from them. We've been going over object orientation for a while. It should feel obvious when you're switching back to functional code. Not all of it has to be object oriented. You can have an index.js that has some imperative code. I would be cautious about not overloading your index.js and trying to have at least 2 different classes with a bit of different behaviors. And I don't want all of your classes that are object oriented to be adapter patterns. I want to see something that you're actually like cards that you're rendering to the page in object orientation. Cool.
You say adapter patterns?
Like our API service class or a DOM service class are 2 examples of like, I guess, service classes. So like, I would like you to use object orientation for not just your fetches and your DOM, like you're grabbing elements from the DOM, but also like have your houses be object oriented. And I'll talk a little bit about what that is. I just know I've been showing a lot of API service classes and a lot of DOM service classes. Those shouldn't be your only object oriented bits of code. Okay.
Yeah, if you can just like highlight that when you get to,
yep.
Or can you throw that in? Awesome, thanks.
Yeah,
visual.
For sure. And then has main relation. We've talked about this. And like their example is really good here. We have photos and comments, right? You can add you can see a bunch of photos and each of them have their own comments. Cool. And then I think that's it. 3 AJAX calls, 3 fetch requests covering read, create, update, and delete. And one heads up here, right? I've definitely had students who add fetch requests that do nothing to try to fulfill this requirement. Don't be one of those students. Don't add an unnecessary fetch request in order to hit the minimum requirement. It won't bring you that far. If it feels like your fetches are unnecessary or a little redundant, they'll call you out on it. Okay. And that's basically all there is for the actual project. I'll note there's a couple things. Like if we built an endless runner game, that encapsulates 0 models, right? We still need 2 more. So the idea of like having a user who can log in and then they can play the game and then their scores get uploaded under them, that would be something that counted for the endless runner game. Cool. And then you don't really need to note the example projects, except Words with Nerds, because that was made by 2 of my cohort mates when I was in the program, and I adore it. It's dope, but none of these suggested projects are actually going to be anything like what your projects are going to look like. unless you really pop off. But this game is cool. You should check it out. It was actually brilliant. But then eventually we're going to go ahead and we're going to talk about a couple of this. I might do like a little review, maybe next week or the week after. But just double check these. Make sure you know how to talk about them a little bit. Cool. I think that's all the things I am going to cover off on. There is yeah, I think like originally those were probably all those projects were listed to inspire you to do something crazy, which is great. Do something crazy, but it is not what most people's projects look like. I think that's it. Obviously, have a blog post, have a video demo. You have, I'm sure some of you have noticed that our actual paying attention to blog posts is spotty at best. Like some reviewers will review you in great detail and be like, hey, you need to like revise this because it's currently 20 words. And some reviewers won't even pay attention to it. The one heads up, if you do bypass that review, that blog requirement, your career coaches will be grumpy at you when you eventually get in touch with them. So if you have some time, build out your blog. Just be prepared to show blogs when you get to your career coaches. We are coming up on that in like only a little bit of time. So you don't want to be that person who has to rewrite 5 blogs when working with career services. Cool. I'm just saying that because I've also, when I was a student, like played games with that requirement for sure. It comes back to bite you a little bit. And I think that basically covers off on all the things I wanted to say. Definitely write your JavaScript in a clean way. Think about like organizing your code and think about refactoring it. It'll go a long way to making your reviewers happy. But that's basically it. You need a blog post for each of your projects. Plus, I think 2. Am I making that up? Yeah, I think you want 7 blog posts total or something. Cool. Before we get started, does anyone have any questions on these requirements? I'm also totally available for asking questions. Ask me questions whenever. And also, when if you think you have 2 ideas for models, right? Ask me about. Just be like, you feel free to like run them by me. Make sure that it makes sense, and that goes for any of your project ideas. I would rather you bounce your idea off of me, and I can warn you about where you might run into trouble, rather than just code along until everything blows up. Okay. And you're in JavaScript now, so the entirety of like your JavaScript stuff is open to you. If you want to create a mobile app that uses locations, or like a mobile first app that uses location, feel free to use any API that you want. This is the time where you get to start experimenting. And one thing that I often get, like, and that a lot of students get when they interview for other companies is, what's something you learned by yourself to solve a problem? And basically what they're looking for is like, what's something you learned outside of a boot camp, like, or outside of your required curriculum for a boot camp to like implement a new cool technology. People are looking to see that you can do that. So if you have the space or the emotional ability during this project, do that now. Feel free to. Otherwise, remember that you can always add to your projects after you after the program ends. So leave space for that if you want to. And one thing that I think a lot of students kind of think is, hey, this is vanilla JavaScript. This isn't like really a portfolio piece, because like a portfolio piece should be written in React. But right, we've spent a lot of time thinking about like really good design patterns in JavaScript, and you have been given like a pretty deep bootcamp experience on JavaScript. So if you want to highlight the fact that like, hey, I can write in vanilla JavaScript, no problem. I can do a ton of things with JavaScript. I can also write really organized code in JavaScript. That's actually a huge flex on other developers. And it will make you look good in an interview. So if you can really pop off with this project, it's absolutely something to be that's worth putting on your resume. Saying like, hey, I needed to do this with vanilla JavaScript. This is how I can write clean code in vanilla JavaScript without a framework. That's something you can brag about. Cool.
Hey, Nikki,
Yeah.
just have a question about the code review.
Yeah.
It seems like this project compared to the other ones has a pretty short list of requirements. The labs and stuff, we went all the way through like advanced functions and it gets pretty deep and technical. So like, how do you recommend that we prepare for the questions that will be asked during the code review? Like how deep and technical will those questions get? And like, is there a good way to study for that?
So this list is pretty good. You're probably not going to be asked about prototypes. You should learn them. You probably will not be asked about them. You will probably be asked a little bit about this and bind. So go back and review that if you can. It's not usually a game, like it's not usually the thing that breaks you, right? But that's probably the hardest question you're going to get. I'll probably do a little review of like in a week or so, where we can just talk about these questions. But like basically, knowing when, like, one thing to know about is just have a good sense of when a variable's in scope versus out of scope. If you define a variable inside of a function, it's not going to be available outside of that function. If you define a variable outside of that function, it will be available inside that function. It can be available inside that function. Apart from that, I urge you to all share study guides. I know that you all have those. Feel free to talk to each other. Ask like, hey, what did you do to review hoisting or something like that? But really what we're looking for is the ability to, like, more than anything, isn't the ability to describe hoisting to me, though that's important. What I'm really looking for do they at least have down the 3 pillars of JavaScript? DOM manipulation, the ability to add elements to the DOM and to like select elements on the DOM and then like change them slightly. That's pillar 1. 2 is the ability to add an event listener to be able to like I'll probably be like, hey, can you add a button that when it's clicked, do this? Or can I have it so that when you scroll over the header, it does this? Those are things that you can be expected to be asked about event listers. And the third one is just fetches, asynchronous JavaScript. That's the third pillar. So can you communicate with your backend using JavaScript? My advice there, earnestly, I think if you can go back and just before array methods are important. But if you can go back and do the DOM challenge again before your review, that's a really good bit of practice for the first 2 pillars. I know that like it'll probably feel a really long time away, like since we actually manually created elements and manipulated them. It's going to be important. That's like the base requirement I'm looking for. Like you should be able to do those 3 things. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's super helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, when I say the backend and that's interchangeable with the API we're building. So those terms I'm using basically synonymously. Like your backend is your API. Cool. Do we have any more questions? So the last thing I think I've seen or floating around from some students, a resource that I didn't see posted on Learn. I might have just skimmed it or on Canvas. But it is a helpful, like certain, I guess, built a walkthrough on building a sample project in JavaScript. I will probably circulate that after this lecture. Okay. So let's get started with actually building a project. I'm I'm going to hop over to this directory that I have. I've mentioned before, my advice for this is you have two different folders and two different repositories, one for the front end, one for the back end. That will make your life easier for deploying it. So right now, I have a very bootleg README because this was a last minute change in lecture plans. But we're going to be building an app that allows you to list apartments or list houses, and then list apartments for those houses. But those houses are all going to be haunted. So we're subdividing haunted houses and renting them out. Cool. Because the only thing scarier than a haunted house is a legally subdivided haunted house is my premise here. So now we currently have a front end folder that just has okay. Oh, that's a really good question. Before we get started, you do not need and you shouldn't expect auth. We are going to be teaching auth in phase 4, and at that point it will be required. If you have a user model, you are totally allowed to. The important thing there is don't worry about sending over a password. I would just be like, hey, who are you? They enter a username, and then you either find or create by that username. Cool. If you are doing a user model, you should be able to see some information about the other users. It shouldn't just be like you enter your name and then it's just a single page. It's just a single page application with one model, right? I should be able to see like other users in the database, or see reviews by other users, or see things that are listed by other users. Okay. Cool. To get started, we currently have just a folder that says front end. This is going to be where we hold our front end code. So I'm going to start out with the first thing we should do, right? When we're building any project, is build the next thing that needs to appear on the page. Cool. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to create index.html. And then right now you have an HTML file, right? People often ask, how do you build out like the basics of a JavaScript application? And I know we haven't really done that almost at all. You can go ahead. Doc is a very good way to do this, right? You could also do HTML5 and it'll do the same thing. And it'll just generate your index, your HTML for you if you're in VS Code. If not, go find some boilerplate HTML. And we're just going to go ahead and we're going to label this ScareBnB. Hello world. Cool. And now we can open this up in our default browser. And we now have hello world here. Cool. We have an HTML document. So I'm going to, at this point, cd into my front end. And I'm going to do a git init right here to initialize an empty repository. I'm going to be like, I'm going to give it an initial commit. And at this point, I'm now going to go to github.com. And here, I'm going to add haunted houses front end. I'm going to call it ScareBnB. And we're really not, we as the realtors on the site aren't looking for haunted houses. We prefer haunted homes. So here we're going to create this repository, and you'll notice it has this thing where it says, hey, if you haven't created anything, or if you've already have a repository in your GitHub, just use this code. And this is the code that you really need to make this work. So I'm just going to copy and paste this back over to here. Cool. And now if I refresh this page, we now have our front end. We have our README. Make sure you have a README, and your README should eventually describe your app. Things that should go in your README as you code along. Any env data you need, anything that people need to do to set up their app. That's stuff that you should be throwing into your README as you code, so you don't forget it later. If you went ahead and you said, make sure to run RailsDB create, or make sure to add an env file in the root of your directory, those are two examples of things that should be in your README. Then you should also describe your app and describe what you're doing. Cool. A good README actually means a lot when you're applying for jobs. People like developers who actually document what they're doing. Because documentation means the difference between an app succeeding or an API or a tool succeeding or failing. Almost all the time. The reason Rails is popular is because the stocks were good. Cool. Same thing with React. So we now have our initial commit, and we've got this hello world on the front end. I can do some basic stuff, right? I'm going to go ahead and I have in my README some CSS that I'm just going to copy in. We're probably not going to be using the modal CSS that I built out, but I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to start creating a folder called assets. And then I'm just going to create style.css. You don't have to put in a thing called assets. I know some people, like some of our documentation just says like, you should really just have like an index .html, a style.css or an index.css, and then like index.js, and then like your source files with all of your objects in it. I'm going to start breaking this out like a pattern that I will see in production every now and then, where it's like you really break things down in different folders. You don't have to follow my lead here. There's some code for a modal. This was me having fun. I'm not sure I'm going to end up doing it. We will eventually run Rails new. Right now, we're just we're just building the front end because we haven't needed a back end yet. Eventually, when we start rendering haunted houses, that's when we're running Rails new. Cool. And touching Bootstrap at all, boilerplate CSS, I don't really think there is stuff, right? Because it's so custom. In this case, I'm just copying it from me coding out beforehand, so you don't watch me like messing with boxes for half of this lecture. But yeah, Bootstrap, and a lot of people swear by Tailwind. You are totally allowed to use Tailwind. You are allowed to use Tailwind, you're allowed to use Bootstrap, you're allowed to use whatever you want, or you're allowed to use vanilla CSS. I would urge you, if you are planning on being a front-end developer, to have some proficiency with both if you're applying for CSS jobs. Be like, hey, I've known how to use a library and I also know how to code stuff out for myself. Cool. So here, I'm going to double check that things changed a little. Oh, right, I didn't load this. So now we're going to go over here and I'm just going to Google style sheet in HTML. Cool. And we can just scroll down to like our external style sheets right here. And this is going to be how we import a style sheet. So loop. And then I'm going to go ahead and say /assets/style.css. There we go. Cool. There we go. That's more like it. And then the last thing, I put in my README that I'm importing a font from Google and I want to. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. Just so we have some spooky fonts. And I think that will allow me to go ahead and say like H1, hello world. Will this work? Nope. Class equals title. I will go ahead and do that later. Eventually, we have some CSS that will use that font. But cool. So we now have some spooky little index.html. Eventually, our app is going to render out a bunch of cards, right, that represent haunted houses. And then when we click into it, we get to a show page. So it's going to feel a lot like what I'm trying to build out is something that, if you're paying attention is pretty similar to how we did restaurants and reviews in Rails. It's going to be like a kind of a similar, like we have a bunch of restaurant cards, then you click and then you go to the show page, and then you can add like reviews and stuff. This case, we're going to be looking at a bunch of haunted homes. You click on it, you can then see a bunch of apartments and you can add apartments. Cool. So at this point, we probably need a backend, right? Our next thing is going to be render out a bunch of cards or a bunch of houses. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to CD out of here, and I'm going to do Rails new, and I'm just going to call this backend or something like that here, because that just names the folder. And then I'm going to use -- API, and then because I plan on deploying it, I'm going to use database equals PostgreSQL. Cool.
Can you scroll up?
Yeah. What do you want to see?
Oh, I just couldn't see what you were typing.
Oh, my bad. Is it like blocked at the bottom of the screen?
Yeah.
Okie doke. First off, I should probably move my Explorer also over to the left side. If I can figure it out. I might do that later. But let's go ahead, and I might actually go ahead and do this in our terminal so that we don't have to worry about it. Cool.
Okay, thank you.
Where's my terminal at? There we go. Cool. So I'm going to CD into my folder. Cool. And then here, let's zoom in. Oops. Gonna run Rails new backend, just naming the folder consistently. -- API, say, hey, this is gonna be an API. And then I'm going to go ahead and say database is PostgreSQL. This is gonna be useful when we start to deploy it. Cool. If you don't have Postgres working, that's fine. You can just use your normal database. But it will make it harder to deploy, and you'll eventually need to change it if you want to. Okay. And now at this point, that was fast. So really that Nokogiri is that slow? All right, sure. So at this point, I'm going to CD into it real quick. Get status. Cool. We now have a bunch of stuff here in our backend folder. You'll notice the general Rails stuff. And in here, we can, first things first, because this is a Rails project. Rails already initialized a GitHub repository for you. So I'm just going to do git add dot git commit initial commit. And then I'm going to do the exact same thing I just did again. So I'm going to go ahead back to my GitHub. I'm going to add a new repository that I'm going to call ScareBnB backend. Cool. I'm going to copy the same code into our terminal. And we now have this on GitHub. Cool. At this point, we should start thinking about how we want to build our app. Right now, I think eventually we're going to have a user model. I haven't decided on that yet. But I think the first thing we should do before we do anything else is be able to list a series of haunted houses. So the first thing I'm probably going to generate is this haunted house minus the user. Cool. And the reason is because this is probably going to be the first thing that my app shows. I want to like be able to see a bunch of haunted houses. So I'm going to go ahead. I'm going to go ahead and pull this back and forth so we can get our terminal. Unless anyone has a quick way to put this on the side. Move panel left. Ooh, that's gross, but I'm in for it. It's still at the bottom. You probably can't see this here. This is probably way worse. Come on. Kill terminal. Move panel at the bottom. I'm gonna go back to our regular terminal. We can go ahead. You can make this smaller for now. Can you see it here? Cool. So now I'm going to do like Rails G resource house. I'm going to give it a name, address, city, state, haunting, and image URL. The haunting is going to be how it's haunted, because I feel like that's important to list. So we can go ahead and run this. Right. We are not in our backend directory. I go ahead and run this. Yeah, I would recommend resource over scaffold. When you get to an API, scaffold doesn't add much, but the code it does add is a little obfuscating, right? Right now, you're not building 5 different resources on every model you're generating. You're building probably 1 or 2 controller actions. So scaffold is going to generate too much, and you're going to have to explain that code to your instructor. Right now, like scaffold doesn't give you much when you're doing a JSON backend. We're rendering our own custom stuff, and we're probably gonna have like 3 or 4 different routes. You could add the no test framework. Like this would work, right? In this case, if you, my big caution there is if you eventually want to demonstrate that you know testing, that is a really good project to do. And like, especially when you graduate, and having a test framework makes that way easier. So this is one of those things where you're welcome to have it and not need it over the alternative. But it's not necessary. And go ahead and actually generate with the test framework. But now we can go about, first off, Rails DB create, because we're working in Postgres. Rails DB drop. Rails DB create. Maybe I should have named it something other than backend. I think that was a bad idea. Because it seems like Postgres uses that name as also what they're going to call your database, and we don't want to compete. So I might like do haunted homes backend. That was a mistake. Cool. But here, let's go about doing Rails DB migrate. Double check that. We have everything we want. Oop. This looks right. Name, address, city, state, haunting, image URL. Cool. So we're gonna run Rails DB migrate. And then now we can go about running Rails C, double checking that our house works. Cool. This works. I'm going to start seeding some houses right now, because our first step isn't going to be to create a house on our front end. It's going to be to create a house on our back end. Cool. Like just all we're going to be doing is showing those houses. So I'm going to go ahead and create some houses. House.create. And I'm already knowing that I'm probably going to need the faker gem to like do some of this. So I'm going to do exit bundle, add faker. Cool. Because I don't want to think of a new town name every single time, or a new address. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to do house.create. Let's go Rails C house.new name. Hill house. It's gonna work. Let's go to our faker gem real quick. Nice. I already was doing this. Let's go to our location. There's got to be a faker for location. It is faker address. There we go. Cool. So Faker will allow us to generate. If you haven't followed me, if this is your first phase with me, Faker is like one of my favorite tools for generating just random data. It'll like, if you call Faker address.street name, it'll come up with a random address like street name. So I'm going to go ahead. I'm going to use that address Faker address.street address and show you what that looks like. Faker address.street. It's going to come up with different addresses for me. Cool. And then I'm also going to do the same thing for do house.new for city, right? Because I don't want to think of a bunch of different city names. Whoop. But for state, because we're dealing with haunted houses, they're all in Maine. Stephen King made sure of that. And the haunting for Hill House is, if you've read the book, it's two roommates and they want to kiss. And then there's an image URL. So let's go ahead and be like Hill House. I take Halloween really seriously. Last year, watched 31 horror movies in October. The year before that, read 10 horror novels. And this works. It's actually based on a place in a university campus in like Massachusetts that I've been to. But it's spooky. We got this. Cool. I think that's everything we need. I'm going to create a couple more. We're going to do the house on Haunted Hill. Cool. This one is Vincent Price going through a messy divorce. We've seen that film. House on Haunted Hill, Vincent Price. Cool. It's sure this is a little evocative. Let's just go ahead and use Vincent Price looking spooky. Cool. And then a third haunted house. That's amazing. It's amazing that you have that poster somewhere. Do we have, I think it's based on a book, and so I think remakes are fine. I might be wrong, but do we have a third haunted house? Anyone? The Whaley House. Ooh. Tell me about the Whaley House. What was this haunting?
I think it's the dad of the people that lived there.
Oh,
Like a
okay.
bunch of his kids died or something. I can't remember specifics. It's in San Diego though.
Gotcha. All right, I'll just add San Diego. Does Nicolas Cage own that one yet?
I don't know, not yet, probably. Someday.
Cool. Eventually this is going to get pretty grisly. Once we start moving away from dad problems. Image URL. Cool. That's big. Great. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to run Rails DB migrate or Rails DB seed. Oops. I typed address wrong. There we go. Rails DB reset. That should do all of it. Great. So now we can take a look, see that this works. Go run Rails S. We can now go to localhost 3000. Get the congratulations, you're on Rails /houses. And we don't get anything. because we haven't created our controller action yet. Cool. But if we go over to houses controller, go def index render JSON houses, and we'll probably give it some houses. Houses equals house.all. Make sense? How are you feeling on this? Cool. I'll refresh this, and we now have, oh, that's gross, but it works, I bet. Yeah, this is a data image. So this is basically the entirety of the data of the image encoded rather than storing it. So when you see these, it's something messy. One thing I'm noticing, we don't need these two things, and we want this to be image URL. We want this image URL to be done in camel case. So I'm going to go ahead right now. I'm going to do bundle add active model serializers, which is my favorite serializer. Oops. Fine, I'm going to actually Google it. Active model serializer, and then we're probably going to also need that key transform code. So I'm going to go ahead. Boop. Right, it was underscores, not hyphens. Let's go to our gem file, and I'm going to paste this one right in here. This is my serializer of choice. You can use your own if you'd like to. Let's go ahead and bundle install, and then we're going to run Rails S, and we can test that things do not change yet. We first want to be like Rails G serializer house. And now this will become our default serializer for when we use our houses. I'm going to refresh this and run Rails S. I'm going to refresh this. Just gives us the ID, but we can go ahead now and let's open up our schema to make sure that we know what we're doing. Oop, I'm going to give us a little bit more space. Here, name, address, city, state, haunting. Eventually, we'll probably add more to this. And image URL. We can go ahead, double check that this works. This is still image URL written the way that I don't like it. With active model serializer. Oh, I'm using Command P that allows you to open up this little search for a file. And it's great. So I'm going to go ahead now, active model serializer key transform, which is a little tool you can use. Go ahead, copy a bunch. Oh, come on. Where's the actual stuff in the documentation? Oh, screw it. We're just going to use RubyDoc. Do I have to like actually click through this documentation like a nerd? Okay, let's go back. Boop. Key. I can just Google it, but oop. active model serializer key transform camel case. Cool. I'm just going to go ahead and click in on any one of these. Probably they'll probably have the code slightly wrong. Just going to Google this to make sure that screw it. Let's go to our config folder really quickly. We're just going to add a new bit of code to run when Rails starts up. We're going to call this serializer. RB. Here, I'm going to paste in. This code looks like it'll work. It's just, I want it to become, I don't want image URL to be underscored because we're going to be working in JavaScript. And underscores are going to make us weird. I'm going to go kill this. I'm going to call Spring stop Rails S. I bet the person who I was having problems on Stack Overflow just messed up creating an initializer. And I'm going to just double check that this works. Cool. Now image URL looks like this. So really what I just did, active model serializers.config.key transform equal camel lower. I put it inside of this needs to be on the other side. Let's move sidebar to the left. I create a new file called serializer in my initializers.rb. What this is really, if you want a really old refresher or you missed this, right? Initializers are just Ruby code that runs when Rails starts up. That has access to the information in Rails. So what we're doing is we're saying, hey, that gem you loaded active model serializers, grab the class that it's related to, grab its config variable, grab its key transform, and set it to camel lowercase before when you're starting up Rails. And then that'll make it behave slightly differently. Really, in the back, like behind the scenes, this is just a setter method. But this is how it works. So whenever you see something that being like, hey, put this in an initializer, what they really mean is just create a file in your initializers in your Ruby, like create a Ruby file in your initializers and make it run this piece of code. So that's just a little bit of a refresher there, or a little bit of an explanation for what that is. And now we have this image URL. Cool. And we're going to need one more thing to get this set up so that it works. But I'm going to go ahead and pretend that we don't so that we can see the error. Cool. Yeah, I'm not sure. We might pass over it a little bit, but we can go ahead. We can add a little script. Oh, come on. Give me something. Source equals dot slash, I'm just going to call this source.index.js, and we can double check that this works. I'm going to give it a little defer action, and this is going to be our main JavaScript file. I'm going to call it the source index.js. You can also have your index.js in your root directory. That's also very normal. But here I'm just going to console log hello world. Great. And now we have hello world showing up. So I'm using defer here, so we don't have to worry about DOM content loaded or anything. It's just a helpful little tool. How are we feeling so far? Cool. Our next step will be to do something like fetch to http://localhost 3000 / houses, but then res to res.json, but then console.log. And we're going to see something interesting happen. I get this error. So does anyone know what this error means?
You failed to fetch because of course.
Yeah. So by default, a Rails API won't just let any app on the internet send a request to it. We need to tell it which apps can take requests. And the way we do this is 2 steps. First, we go into our gem file. And you'll find in here commented out gem rack cores. Cool. I'm going to put that in there and then I'm going to rebundle install. I'm going to call Rails S again. Or no, then I'm going to wait 1 second. And then inside of your config file, in a pre-existing initializer, so somebody else's Ruby code, they have this commented out code. Cool. I'm going to comment this in. And then I'm going to say, hey, I welcome requests from any origin. This is bad to do in a production level app. I'm totally fine with you doing it for your project, but be aware, you should probably specify which requests you accept it from. Being like, hey, I'm going to accept this from my production page, right? hauntedhomes.com or ScareBnB.biz or ScareBnB.horse would all be acceptable here. But for now, the star says any origin is fine. Cool. We can check out that this now works. And now you'll notice we get 3 houses back. Cool. So at this point, I'm going to show you a design pattern that's really useful for when you're dealing with multiple different pages that are all going to be kind of shown. We're going to be swapping between without refreshing the page. Basically, how it starts is I'm going to have, and this is kind of how React does it too. Over in index.html, I'm just going to have a div class equals, or div ID equals main or whatever. I think that's what I'm going to call it. And this is just going to be, what we're replacing every single time we want to render a new page. We just replace the HTML in here. I'm going to call this ScareBnB first off. And then we are going to also have something that I don't want to see any of you use, but I can't help it. A marquee tag, which has been once again deprecated since back in my Neopets days. And I'm going to have it say, and then we currently got this going on. This works for me. And basically what I'm going to have is this is just going to be the header that exists throughout everything, right? And here, this main HTML is going to be the one that we basically replace with new HTML whenever we do something. So I'm going to go ahead. At this point, I'm already going to start refactoring because I'm me. But I'm going to create a new folder that I'm going to call services. In it, I'm going to create let's call it API service first. .js. And here I'm going to give a little class API service. Boop. And we're going to create a get houses. Oh, I actually do want to have a constructor here. And this is going to allow me to refactor my index.js to say const API equals API service. I'm initializing this API service like this. And then I can go ahead and say API.get houses, then console log. And we can double check that this still works. Oh, there we go. We gotta put in here. I call these services. I like breaking these out into a separate folder because really they're in charge of just some utility code that I want to use elsewhere. And let's go ahead. Make this work. We're now back to operational. And we now have this little service class that's going to do stuff for us. The next step, right? I'm just going to go ahead now and I'm going to create a first class that I'm going to create a new folder called components for my actual stuff that's going to like really appear on the DOM. And in it, components is like, this is going to be a file structure that you don't necessarily need to do, but eventually in React, we're going to have components and containers. And I'm starting to like just do a little bit of it like exposure so it doesn't feel weird. Components are going to be things that I kind of want to appear on the page. So one of those is going to be house.js. Cool. We're gonna call class house. Let's keep it like this for now. Oops. Great. And then here, I'm actually going to start thinking about how I want to get these houses and then render them. First off, this call, I kind of want to not be like just some manual code in my index.js. I'm going to instead create a static get houses method. And here I'm going to call like API.get houses, then let's go ahead and houses dot for each. We can not be very. I'm going to create a little method to add a house. This might be overly refactored for just getting started. If you want to like start by making this functional oriented code and then move it over here, that's totally fine. But I'm just going to go ahead and I'm going to say new house. And then here I'm going to call constructor house. This is really going to be the data for the house. So I'm just going to be like data, this.data equals data. And at this point, basically, this is where I think I'm flying through things. And I should probably slow down and talk about what I want to do. Basically, my goal here is to create a bunch of houses that can then render themselves as cards and then render their own show action. So I'm going to do something that seems familiar first, and then I'm going to do a couple of new things with it. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about what I'm doing. I'm going to be like this.constructor, all.push this. Let's go ahead and console log it. Oop. Oh, right. I need to actually go ahead and use this. API, wait, no, house.get houses. You'll now notice my data just is all my stuff from my backend. Because ultimately the house is both like a bunch of data, right? That represents the actual house and a bunch of behaviors. I'm just going ahead and storing these as under the data key on this. but you can call it whatever you want. If I want it to be like, hey, each house has its own like house.house, right? That's something that I've done before, where I go ahead and I say this dot house equals data. And then all of our stuff on the back end is there. But yeah. So now, basically, what I'm going to go ahead and do is then I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to say render house index. Cool. And in here, I'm going to start doing some crazy stuff. First off, I'm going to grab this document, like get element by ID main dot inner HTML equals, and we don't need to use inner HTML here. You can totally, this would probably be easier if we create our own elements. We can go ahead and do that. I'm going to be like create const house container equals document dot create element div dot append child house container. We'll give this house container. They give it an ID or a class here. I'm gonna like actually like take a look at our CSS class house container. Cool. I'm gonna go ahead and I'm gonna do that. I'm gonna clear out a bunch of this too. Boop. Cancel. Screw it. Boop. Boop. And then I'm going to go ahead and add a house container. And here I'm just going to go ahead and going to call this that render house index. Or we can just call render index because inside of our action. I'm also going to get rid of add house from this. It's going to be like house.create or house.add. Then we're going to call this render index. And we're going to see what this does. It's not going to do much yet. But if we inspect the page, we will now see that in here, there's a div with a class of house container. So I'm just adding a new container, right? I'm calling it from this render index code. And then here, I'm just going to go, right? This dot all dot for each. And then I'm just going to call house dot render card. And that's not a function I've created yet. This is redundant. I can just go ahead and I can say render card. No, I think that probably is a bad idea. You probably want to call it on house. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to start creating our first little method. Render card. Cool. I'm going to go ahead, double check my README real quick to make sure that they should be made up of cards called house card. Okay. Class equals house card. And here I'm just going to go ahead and I'm going to say, hey, document get element or query selector dot house container dot inner HTML plus equals this little bad boy right here. And here I'm going to go ahead. I'm going to start writing some little code. I'm going to go ahead and say image source equals. Oh, let's actually do like a little bit of destructuring here. Const name, address, city, state, font thing, and image URL written like this, and ID equals this data. Cool. And here I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to give this an image URL. And then I'm going to give it an alt of name so that if they're using it with screen readers, they still get the name. We're going to go ahead and give this a little p tag. That's and then I guess I'm just going to give this just the address for now. City, comma, state. I don't think my add method is actually doing much. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm just going to go delete this entirely. This is the problem with refactoring. It's calling new house. Cool. Premature refactoring is never good. And you just saw me with a demonstration of why. Let's go ahead and refresh this page. And now we get a bunch of cards that aren't showing up the way I wanted them to. What the heck? And they still show up. There's some CSS, but these are not in Flexbox. What's going on here? I call this wrong. House container. That looks like a hash. That doesn't look like an ID. Oh no. Right, and they actually have to select it. Get elements by ID. Cool.
You have a period in line 11.
Smart. Nice, good spot. There we go. Cool. We now have 3 houses. I'm going to step back. That was a lot. Right.
Nikki, I have a quick question. In render index, you created a div, what's it called? House container, and then you did it again for the render card function. Why are you creating the same div like twice?
I'm not. These are 2 different sets of divs. So this right here is creating a div called the house container. Its job is to create this div right here that holds all of the houses. Cool.
Mm-hmm.
And then inside of this, I'm selecting that initial house container, right? But I'm actually adding new house cards in here.
Oh, sorry, I didn't see that. Okay, I see.
Yeah, this is kind of why I'm taking a step back right now. Right now, I'm calling house.getHouses. And we could even like break this out into 2 different things. So I feel like this is doing a couple of different things in one go. We don't need to do that yet. I'm prematurely refactoring. So what I'm doing here is I'm calling get houses, right? We're going to talk about apartments later. Right now, I'm going to show the 2 different pages. And I think right now, since we're so close to out of time, I'm probably going to do the belongs to on Tuesday. Cool. But here, we're iterating through the houses from the API. We're creating a bunch of different houses. We're initializing them. We're storing them in our static all, right? And then after we're doing that, we're calling this render index method, which is going to go ahead and it's going to, because right now, like these 2 things don't rely on a specific house. So we're using static because it's more, this is something that is a behavior that relates to houses. So it makes sense to store it inside our house class, but it doesn't relate to a specific house. So it makes sense to call it a static function rather than an instance method. Does that make sense? So we're getting all of our houses, we're storing them into this array of all houses, and then we're basically creating our own little house container, right? And in it, we're iterating through all of our houses and calling their render card method, which is selecting this house container and just appending some additional inner HTML to them. Cool. So this is still nothing that's too unusual. Some of my structure is weird in that I'm making them into static methods rather than just calling them in the outset. And that's because I want to be able to call them again for a very good reason that you will get to in a second. So currently I've got some CSS so that when these are hovered over, it looks like there's a pointer, despite the fact that they're not really links. To do that in my CSS, I did cursor pointer over these. Cool. But apart from this, we're still just going through and we're rendering out some cards. At this point, yeah, you can change your cursor to do whatever you want. I've never really done it outside of like the defaults, but I think you can load images into your cursor for a CSS. It was certainly all the rage in 2002. So I urge you to do the same thing. So right now we're rendering a bunch of houses, right? Next, I want to make it so that if you click on them, specifically on this or on this, it renders a show page, which is going to be a little interesting. First things first, we're going to have to add an event listener and then figure out what we're clicking on. Because we use inner HTML. We have no way of from the click determining what we're clicking. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to say in my render index, whenever I render my index, I want to then do house container that add event listener for a click. And we can go ahead and say handle index click. And here, I'm going to make this a static method. So I'm going to call this on house or this, which are the same right now. House is going to be, oh, whoa, I'm going to make these arrow functions. I don't think it's a problem for this one, but eventually this will be a problem. I might show you that later. But let's go ahead and let's create a little static handle index click. Take an E console.log e.target. Take a look at our stuff. Now, anywhere we click around here, it's going to give us what we're clicking on. What I want to do is whenever I click on an image or a title, I want to find out what the ID of what we're clicking on is. And then I want to basically create a render method for a house that renders a whole show page. Let me show you what I'm going to do here. So there's going to be a couple of things that feel pretty similar. First off, we don't have any data to say, hey, this is the house we're clicking on. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to give this a data ID, which is a pattern that you might be familiar with me doing right now. And then first thing I'm going to do, so I'm going to say like if e.target, if it's dot tag name equals image, or if e.target dot class list dot contains title. So if we're clicking on either the image or the title, let's console log. Cool. I refresh this. Now, if I click here, it doesn't do anything. If I click here, console logs an image. If I click here, it console logs this title. If I click here, different one. Did I lose anybody on this? Like this, some of the syntax here might be a little old. But to grab the element's tag name to find out like, hey, what's going on right here? We go ahead and call tag name, and we're comparing it to image uppercase. Tag name just always returns an uppercase. And here we're saying, hey, if you're clicking on if you're clicking on anything that has a class of title, then this will work. So what we're saying here is if either of those things are clicked, then let's console u.target. Cool.
Nikki,
Yeah.
if you had images out of that div, the house container div, you had other images, then would e.target.tag name equals image still work?
It would still fire, but notice that I'm currently adding this event listener to house container directly. And I know that house container only contains images that are in the cards. If I ended up adding images outside of those cards, I might have to be more specific if I didn't want to get errors in my console.
I see. Okay, thank you.
And then right here, whatever we're clicking on, if we just want to get back to the whole house card, right? We can all do that closest house card like this. And I'm going to go ahead and show that this works. Oops. House card like this. Cool. So now, regardless of what we're clicking on, we get the whole house card, right? This is a pattern that I've used a few times. And if I wanted to get the ID, now I can call .dataset.id because I've added this data hyphen ID equals ID up here. Make sure if you're using dataset, you just know that you can be like, hey, because I added this data hyphen ID right here. And the HTML here translates into a key value pair in JavaScript that you can access data set. Cool. So I'm going to double check that this works. Oops, let's save. Cool. This one I get the ID of 1. This one I get the ID of 2. Now, in order to actually get back to the instance, I'm going to create a find method that takes in an ID. Does this.all.find, and we go through each house, and we do house.data.id. Give me the first one that has this ID. So I'm going to go ahead and show you what that looks like in the browser. House.find 1 now gives me a house. House.find 2 gives me a different house. Cool. This one is Hill House or Haunted Hill. This one is Hill House. And now I'm going to just go ahead and say this.find ID.render show. And I'm going to call this render show method. Boop. And we're going to go about 10 minutes over. I'm sorry, I've been going over so often. I want to show you this today because I promised that we would show how multiple pages can work. I'm going to go ahead now. I'm going to check this out. Oops. Did I delete that like a fool? Great. Const ID equals this bad boy. Cool. This is going to go ahead and console.log this. Cool. So when we click here, we get a house. Next thing I'm going to do is basically, I'm going to go back and grab my main. Oops, come on, buddy. And then I'm going to go right here. I'm going to go say .inner HTML equals. And here, I'm going to give it h1/h1 Let's go back to my schema. So I remember what's in here. Going to go back to destructuring. Equals this dot data. Cool. So I'm just going ahead. I'm writing all this HTML in here. And this is all going to go inside this main. And I'm using equals, not plus equals. Let's see what this does. Well, this broke. But if I go back, am I doing something slightly wrong here? There we go. A little bit messy, but cool. We now have a little house. I'm going to give this an alt because we're not bad. Let's give this name. And you'll now notice that by clicking here, we just replace the inner HTML with this new HTML that works. If we want to now make this fully interactive, right? We still have this render index method, right? So one thing I'm going to do here is I'm going to go now add a little button. ID equals go back. Go back. And then I'm going to even go ahead and do like document get element by ID. Go back. Add event listener. Click. And then here, I'm just going to go ahead and I'm going to call house.render index. And I'm not using the parentheses because I don't want to invoke it immediately. I want to pass it into the event listener. Now, if we click here, this weird thing happens. It actually appends it to the bottom. I'm going to change a little bit of my code right here. The reason is because here I'm just appending the child, but we can always do before we do that, we can always clear out. I'm going to go ahead and const main equals. I'm probably going to refactor this into its own like little helper pattern. I could be like main.append child this. Before I could do that, I could be like main.inner HTML equals empty. Just like clear out my main div. And now if we click this, we get here, we go back, this works. And really what we just did to make that work, it looks really elegant, but what we just did is we cleared out our inner HTML and replaced it with new stuff that we're just generating from a function. So our render index right here goes ahead and creates, let's actually make this a little bit. First off, we grab our main container, we wipe out its inner HTML, and we replace it with new inner HTML. Then we call a different function. We just replace it with different inner HTML. Cool? And this looks like we're going to new pages. But really what we're just doing here is we're calling a different method that renders different inner HTML. And this is something that is way, way easier to do if you thoughtfully use object orientation. If you're using functional patterns, this is a little bit difficult. You have to like go ahead and send this house information back into render show, right? But because we have this information, we're good. What's the weirdest part of this and how are we all feeling?
I got lost on the back button, but I looked away for a second.
For sure. So I added this go back button, right? And then I gave it this event listener to click that just recalls my render index code, right? Which render index clears out our main's HTML. Then it creates an element called house container, then iterates through all of our houses and renders them. Cool.
Yeah, I think what I was thinking it was doing was showing the one house, but I got it reversed. We're going back to all the houses.
Yeah.
Hey, Nikki, I have a question in the code.
Yeah.
The render index, is it possible? Because my weakness is like, you see how you're calling render index at the bottom and render show at the top. Is it possible or is it okay if I like reverse it if in case I was to do it on my own?
Oh yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So I'm going to go ahead. So the thing about render show, the reason I'm doing it here is because this is an instance method and this is a class method. But you're right. It doesn't necessarily make sense for this order to be this way. So totally up to you how you want to handle it. And this order is probably out of order. I was just arbitrarily coding.
Okay.
I would definitely move this one down because we are calling it in the previous method. And I would probably move this one up a little bit. Be like, hey, this is our workflow for getting a house, right?
Right.
But yeah.
Thank you.
So to move something around, right? Alt up and down will move your code up and down. And this isn't the only pattern, render index and render show. Sometimes these get broken out into two different two different methods, right? Or two different classes. There's a bunch of other things like in React, it's very explicitly like, hey, we are using different components here, and we kind of keep the components separate from our database. But the big important thing here is that we're grabbing our main and then we're rewriting what's inside of it. Every single time we want to render kind of a new page. How are we all feeling? Is this one of those lectures that makes us feel like, hey, I think I'm a little bit more prepared for the project, or hey, I think I'm totally prepared for the project? A little bit of both.
This was super helpful.
Cool.
Nikki, I have a question.
Yeah.
So the document get element by ID is basically the main thing that says, take all this HTML and then re-render it somehow in this fashion. So you can use that anywhere you'd like.
So this is just to select the main component, right? And then inner HTML equals is saying, hey, everything that's inside of it is now whatever I put here, right? If I made inner HTML equal to an H1 that says hello, right? It'll overwrite it.
Right, so the main being the HTML that the user is seeing at any given time, or is that
main is just this div right here? Yeah.
Right. So when you grab that, that's suggesting, okay, this is taking precedence now, whatever I'm putting in.
What you're saying is, hey, I'm grabbing this element. I'm going to be rewriting its inner HTML, right? So all the code I'm really writing, I'm writing inside of main, right? This house container is originally created and appended to the main. And then when we go here, we are rewriting main to instead be a show page. And the reason I'm creating this inside of a div called main is maybe at one point I want a nav bar that exists between pages, right? I might want to go ahead and create something up here that goes ahead and says like nav div. And we probably have like a see all houses. We probably have like a little add a house. And then if we go over here, now this exists here, but it will also exist here because I've only changed what's in main. Cool. Thumbs up, thumbs sideways, thumbs down. All right.
That's just the ordering. Oh, sorry.
Yeah,
sorry.
no, go ahead.
So the ordering, which took precedence there when you did that? I'm sorry. I just wanted to see you do it one more time.
The main versus adding this bad boy.
Yeah, like you added on.
Ordering doesn't
another-
matter right here, except in terms of how it shows up. So if I say hi here and hello here, it just hello will appear at the top, hi will appear at the bottom. And then anything that isn't main isn't getting overridden because I wrote my code that way. I said, hey, the main part of the page is what's getting overridden every single time I want to render something new. But really what's happening is I'm just selecting this HTML element and then rewriting its code in what's inside of it using inner HTML.
Right. Thank you.
Cool. On Tuesday, we are going to be going over adding a bunch of different apartments. I think that over on tomorrow during office hours, I'm going to do a fun little thing where we add a house, and I'm probably going to use a modal for that, which is just like a little pop-up that shows up over your code. So that's going to be a little bit of advanced CSS work. And it's probably going to be a little bit hard to teach because I'm going to be like copying stuff from W3 schools. But that can be a fun little, that'll be a fun little thing that'll show you a little bit more about how like things work in the modern internet. Cool. All right. I'm going to stop sharing. I'm going to let you go. Thank you. Eventually we will chill out on these long lectures, but good night, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.